My wife passed away 2 years ago. I thought I'd buried every secret we ever shared until a letter arrived written by her 41 years earlier. A letter that carried a name I'd never heard and a mystery that changed everything. This is the story of the last letter, a heartfelt mystery about love, loss, secrets, and redemption. A story of how one forgotten envelope led me to a daughter I never knew existed, and to the truth my wife had spent a lifetime trying to send home. If you believe in second chances, forgiveness, and the power of love that never dies, this story is for you. If you love emotional stories about love, loss, and redemption, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps these heartfelt stories reach more people who believe in second chances. It had been an ordinary evening, or as ordinary as life could be since Margaret passed. The cottage sat quiet on the edge of Willow Creek, surrounded by tall grass and oak trees that rustled like an old hymn. After 48 years together, the silence she left behind had its own shape. I had learned to live inside it, moving gently, as though afraid to wake the ghosts of laughter that lingered in the corners. The radio murmured from the kitchen, a soft jazz station from Springfield that still played the old standards. I'd made a habit of tuning in around twilight, when the world slowed down and the light spilled across the floorboards in amber bands. The kettle was on, the smell of peppermint tea in the air. I had been sorting through a cedar box that evening, our letters. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, tied together with fading ribbon. I'd written most of them during my years traveling for work. She'd written hers from the little classroom where she taught music at the elementary school. Margaret had beautiful handwriting, each letter precise and patient, as if she knew words were fragile things that deserved care. As I opened each envelope, I could almost hear her voice again. The way she'd say Tom, never Thomas, when she wanted my attention. The sound of her laughter through paper-thin walls on summer nights. I hadn't planned to cry, but the years have a way of loosening things you thought you'd already tucked away. That's when I heard it. The knock. At first I thought I imagined it. Just the kettle settling or the creak of old wood. But then it came again, 3 steady taps that seemed to come from deep inside the evening itself. When I opened the door, a young man stood there. Late 20s, maybe. He had travel-worn clothes and a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. His face was kind, though tired, and his hair was damp from the mist rolling off the fields. "Mr. Carver?" he asked. I nodded. "That's right." He gave a small, hesitant smile and held out the envelope. "This was found in an old desk at the Ashfield post office. My uncle worked there before it closed down. He was cleaning out the building and came across a drawer full of undelivered mail. Most of it was junk old bills, postcards, but this one, he said, it looked important. He wanted to make sure it reached the right person. The envelope was thick, sealed with a circle of red wax, its surface worn soft from time. My name, written in looping script, stared up at me, Thomas Carver. But it was the return name in the corner that stopped me cold. Margaret L. Carver. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I ran my thumb over the ink, faded but unmistakable. "This was sent 41 years ago," the young man continued quietly. "April 12th, 1984. The date hit me like a stone dropped in still water. 1984, 39 years before she died, long before we ever moved to Willow Creek. Back when our daughter Lily was still little. Back when Margaret's hair was still chestnut, and her laughter filled the house every morning." "Who was it sent to?" I asked, my voice thinner than I intended. He hesitated. "That's the strange part. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a single initial on the front." He pointed to the corner near the wax seal. I leaned closer and saw it barely visible, written in faded ink. Any idea who that might be?" I asked. He shrugged. "No, sir. My uncle didn't know either. Said he felt like it was meant to be delivered to you. I can leave it if you'd like." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it felt alive, like it was holding something that had waited too long. The young man tipped his hat, offered a polite smile, and turned to leave. His boots made soft thuds down the steps, then disappeared into the mist. The last thing I saw was the glint of his satchel buckle catching the lamplight before he vanished down the path toward the road. I stood there for a long while after he left. The letter trembled slightly in my hand. Somewhere across the creek, a dog barked once and then stopped. The world felt hollow, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Inside, the kettle screamed, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness. I set the envelope on the table and turned off the stove. I poured a cup of tea I didn't drink. For several minutes, I just stared at it. Margaret's handwriting had always been graceful, confident. The seal glistened faintly in the lamplight, its wax cracked but still whole. I traced the curve of her name, the date. I tried to remember what was happening in April of 1984. That spring we'd been living in Boston. I was working long hours at the docks and she was teaching music at Jefferson Elementary. We were saving to buy our first real home. It had been a hopeful time, though not without its shadows. There had been something that year, an argument maybe. One of those things couples carry quietly for a lifetime. I couldn't quite recall it, but I could feel it in my chest like an old bruise. Who was E? A friend? A student? Someone she'd known long before me? I told myself it didn't matter. It was probably some harmless relic of the past, a letter lost before it ever reached its destination. But deep down, a small, cold unease began to stir. Margaret had never kept secrets from me, or at least I'd believed she hadn't. The thought that she might have, well, that was something I wasn't ready to face. Outside, the wind shifted. The sound of leaves brushing against the window filled the room. I looked toward the photo of Margaret that hung above the mantel. She was smiling in that picture, wearing the blue dress she'd worn to our daughter's wedding. Her hair, silver by then, framed her face softly. "I got a letter from you today," I murmured to her photograph, forcing a small laugh that didn't quite sound like me. 41 years late. The photograph, of course, said nothing. But the silence felt heavier, as if the house itself was listening. I reached for the envelope again. My fingers hesitated at the seal. My pulse quickened. I wanted to open it, needed to, but something inside me whispered to wait. Just then, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The kettle whined softly in the background as the last glow of the sunset faded from the window. And that's when I heard her voice. Soft, gentle, impossible. "Don't read it yet, Thomas." I froze. It wasn't a memory, at least, not entirely. It was her voice, clear as the day she died. A sound that didn't belong in that empty room. My throat tightened. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see her standing there. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator winding down, the creak of the floor beneath my feet, the distant rush of wind through the trees. I whispered, "Margaret?" No answer. But the scent of lilacs drifted through the air, the same perfume she used to wear in spring. Sweet, clean, faint but unmistakable. My knees felt weak. I sat back down, one hand on the table, the other still clutching the edge of the envelope. I couldn't tell if it was fear or longing that made my heart ache the way it did. The letter waited in the darkness, a silent promise I didn't yet understand. I lit a candle from the drawer by the stove. The flame flickered, throwing soft shadows across the walls. The house looked different in candlelight, older, like it remembered more than I did. I carried the candle to the mantel and set it beside Margaret's photograph. The letter lay there too, its red seal catching the flame. "I'll open it tomorrow," I said quietly, though no one was there to hear me. "Tomorrow, when there's daylight." Her picture smiled back, patient as ever. But even as I said it, I knew tomorrow would bring more than I was ready for. Outside, the wind rose through the trees, rattling the old shutters. Rain began to fall soft at first, then steadier, drumming against the roof like an old memory. I sat there long after midnight, staring at that letter until the candle burned low and the wax ran thin. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letter, the wax seal, the faint handwriting that looked like it had been written just yesterday. And in the half-light between waking and dreaming, I saw her face young again, smiling the way she did in those early years, before time and sorrow marked us both. "Don't read it yet," she whispered once more, and then she was gone. When morning came, the letter was still on the mantel, waiting, the seal unbroken. The air in the room felt different, charged somehow, as if the house itself knew something I didn't. I poured a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and stared at it through the quiet. Whatever truth it held, I knew one thing for certain: my life would never be the same once I opened it. I stood in the dark of an abandoned bank vault, the air thin and cold, my breath blooming white. The safety deposit drawer slid open with a groan, and inside lay a small velvet pouch and a note in Margaret's handwriting that said, 4E, if I do not return. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped it. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed on its own, and the faint scent of lilacs rose like a memory refusing to die. Looking back now, I see that everything began with the first seal breaking and the second lock waiting in the dark. By morning, I told myself there would be daylight and answers. There was daylight, at least. The storm had passed in the night. When I woke, the cottage felt rinsed and clean, the windows filmed with dew. The world outside was bright in that unsteady way after rain, blue sky torn open and stitched with quick clouds. Birds were at the feeder again. The electric clock blinked 1200 in a stubborn green. Somewhere, an old floorboard ticked like a metronome for the silent piano Margaret hadn't played in years. The letters still waited on the mantel unopened, the red wax catching a blade of sun. I'd set coffee to percolate and watched it like it might reveal something if I stared hard enough. It didn't. Coffee never does. It only warms your hands and gives you courage, or at least the illusion of it. I carried my mug to the mantel and stood facing her photo. Same smile as always. The blue dress. The kind eyes that could settle a room. I could feel the drag of sleep still clinging to me. The soft bruise of last night's voice. Don't read it yet, Thomas echoing in the hollow behind my ribs. But morning has a way of shaming ghosts. The house was all bright edges and ordinary sounds. If there'd been any whisper of Margaret, the sunlight had taken it back. All right, I said quietly. We open it. I set the envelope on the table and sat down, the chair complaining under me. Up close, I could see more than I had in candlelight. The cheap fiber of aging paper, the faint smudges where a thumb had pressed too hard, a watermark like a pale oval grape under the surface. My name stood steady, Thomas Carver, in Margaret's sure hand. In the corner was her return name, in the address of our apartment in Boston back then, Jefferson Street, with its peeling paint and row of maples that shed too early in fall. And there was the other mark, the one the young man had pointed out. It was not an address, not really. It was impressed into the wax itself, a slender initial stamped into the red. E, as if the letter had been sealed for someone else and still sent to me. The contradiction sat between my shoulders like a weight. I could almost hear the kid's voice again. That's the strange part. He had not been wrong. It was strange. I ran my thumb along the wax and felt its ridges, a tiny mountain range hardened by time. I thought of all the years between then and now, everything that had happened and everything we had survived. Love is made of ordinary days, but a secret can cut through those days like winter through old wood. Here we go, I whispered, the way you do when you step into cold water. I reached for the letter opener, an old brass bird with a blunt beak I'd bought at a yard sale the year Margaret retired. She'd teased me for it, called it my dignified knife. The beak slid under the flap with a small, decisive sound. The wax gave like a cartilage snap, and then the envelope loosed its hold, a breath releasing after 41 years. For a moment, I did nothing. I just stared at the broken wax, at the gap in the paper, at my own spotty hands bracing the edges. If there is a second before your life changes, you can feel it like a thin ledge under your feet. I drew out the pages. There were 2 sheets, both folded, both smelling faintly of something sweet. Not perfume exactly, not anymore. Time had softened it into a shadow of scent, like lilacs after rain. I pressed the top of the stack to my nose. Before I knew what I was doing, the way you lean into an old sweater just to feel the ghost of the person who once warmed it. Her handwriting flowed across the first page, steady, composed, the script of a woman who had learned to teach children their letters and had never forgotten. That letters are how we find each other in the dark. It began April 10, 1984. Dear E. My heart thumped once hard and then steadied like a stubborn engine. I read, Dear E. I have thought and prayed and sat awake against this kitchen table more hours than I can admit. I know you believe we have no time, and perhaps we don't. But I cannot do this in shadows. I promised Thomas the kind of marriage that looks him in the eye. I promised myself I would not be a coward. We are not owed forgiveness for our foolishness, but we are owed the truth. I stopped, swallowing. Something cold opened in the center of me, a door to a room I didn't know existed. I kept going. I cannot meet you at the Mariner on Thursday as you asked. I will not. You will find what you want in the deposit box at Ashfield Savings and Trust. The key is enclosed. If I do not return by Sunday, I ask you to take it and do what you said you would. Do not come to the apartment. Do not write me again. The longer this lives in ink, the heavier it becomes. I cannot bear that weight and keep my promise to my husband. For what it's worth, I hope you find peace. I hope we both do. Hemim. My eyes blurred. The words broke apart into small, jagged pieces. I set the page down and looked at the second sheet. A penciled sketch of a square grid with locker numbers, and a small note box 317. Teller will ask for the card. They know me as Ms. Lowell. Ask for Mrs. Hester if there is trouble. At the bottom, taped to the paper with yellowed cellophane, a small brass key no larger than my thumb. I touched the key. It was cold, real. 41 years had not worn its teeth smooth. The tape crackled as I peeled it back. The key came free with a tiny sound that seemed far too loud in my quiet kitchen. On the flap of the envelope, written faintly as if added at the last second, a line, if this reaches Thomas, forgive me. I stood so quickly the chair groaned and slid back. The house felt too small. The sunlight too bright. I could hear my pulse in my ears like a tide coming in. Margaret, I said, as if I might scold the air and it would answer me. What did you do? What did I miss? I walked the room the way I used to in difficult nights when our daughter was between calls, and Margaret's breathing was thin and uneven in the next room. Step, breathe, turn, repeat. It seemed impossible that I'd been living with a woman I loved more than my own past and had not known this. This E, this bank box, this plan like a splinter under the skin of our life. I went back to the table and read the letter again, slowly this time, turning each sentence over, searching for a place where the light could slip in differently. The words did not change. We are not owed forgiveness for our foolishness, but we are owed the truth. Foolishness, forgiveness. Those were not words we used often with each other, not like that. It wasn't her way, and yet the tone was so unmistakably hers, the calm, the discipline, the refusal to let a hard thing remain untended. I set the pages down and rubbed my face with both hands. The coffee had gone cold. The birds at the feeder chirred and squabbled the way they always did, unaware a hinge had broken somewhere inside the man behind the glass. I looked again at the signature. Just M, not Margaret, not Maggie, the name her sister used, a name she disliked in everyone else's mouth but endured in Ruth's. Hemim. And the salutation had been Dear E. It wasn't a name I knew, no family member, no student, no colleague. E could be anyone. E could be no one. The human mind is a cruel inventor when it's left to guess. My eyes slid across the room to the mantel. Her picture, the blue dress, the easy smile, and behind it the piano, silent and dusted, its fallboard close. In the corner by the music stand, the old metronome tilted at an angle, frozen in the wrong place. I stood and went to the instrument. My reflection wobbled in the dark wood, like a version of me I didn't trust. I lifted the fallboard and pressed one key, then another. The notes fell into the air, a little thin, a little out of tune, but still themselves. Somewhere in the house there was the faint smell of lilacs again, so gentle it could have been the damp spring pushing through the screens. Don't read it yet, she had said, but I had. And now the reading had become a road I could not leave. I took the key in my palm and felt its weight. I looked at the penciled sketch again, box 317, Ashfield Savings and Trust. I hadn't been to Ashfield in years. Not since they folded it into some bigger bank with a new name and a colder lobby. The building itself still stood near the green-white columns and an old clock that always ran fast. If the box still existed, it would be somewhere in that belly of marble and bad lighting. If the bank had dissolved, maybe the boxes had been transferred. Maybe they hadn't. There was so much I didn't know. In the lower margin of the second page, almost hidden, was a small flourish. An E written lightly as if someone had tested a pen, or as if the letter itself were marked for a person who would never receive it. I set everything back on the table in a careful arrangement, as if neatness could contain any of it. I washed my cup. I dried it. I put it away. I wiped the counter as if crumbs were the problem and not the past. When I finally sat again, the cottage felt too quiet. I reached for the phone. My thumb hovered over our daughter's name. Lily had her own life, her own kind of storms. She'd call me twice a week no matter what, as faithful as sunrise. And we'd talk about her garden and the dog and whether she should switch car insurance. I almost pressed the button, almost said, "Your mother wrote a letter to someone named E before you had your first recital, and I'm going to a bank today to find out how it breaks us." I didn't. I set the phone down. This was a thing I had to walk into alone. I took an envelope from the drawer and slipped Margaret's pages inside. I slid the key into my pocket, where it sat cool against my thigh. I put on my jacket, the heavy brown one with the elbow patches she used to tease me about, and I stood again in front of her photo. "Help me," I said, not loud, not soft, just honest. The house answered with nothing but the ticking of the halt-faced clock. The old Ford coughed awake after a stubborn turn. The road into town had puddled where the culverts never quite keep up, and the fields shone with sheets of water that mirrored the sky. Willow Creek ran brown and fast under the bridge, hurrying somewhere the way all creeks hurry after rain. Maple leaves littered the shoulders, slick as tongues. Halfway to Ashfield, the radio gave me Ella Fitzgerald, easy and sure, crooning to a band that understood patience. I let her sing to the empty passenger seat. There are voices that live in your body like a loyal dog. Hers was one. Margaret's was another. By the time I reached Ashfield, the morning had settled into itself. The green was muddy and quiet. The old post office sat dark and boarded, the window ribboned with a notice from a year I did not want to count. I thought of the young man on my porch, his satchel, his uncle, that forgotten drawer. The bank stood across from the library, its columns too proud for a place that still smelled like pencil shavings inside. The glass door gave a soft resistance before it yielded. New signage, a new logo with a safe, nervous font. A woman in her 50s sat behind a desk by the window. The whole place, divided into glass cubicles designed by people who did not understand small towns or secrets. Behind her, along the back wall, a row of beveled doors led to rooms with worse lighting. "Good morning," she said, looking up like she meant it. "How can we help you today?" I took off my hat. "I'm here about a safety deposit box. A very old one." Her smile lifted the way a gate lifts. "We can try. Do you know the box number?" "Yes." I set the envelope on her desk and slid out the second page, the one with the pencil sketch. 317? She glanced at it and then at me. "And do you have your key?" I patted my pocket. "I do." "Wonderful." She stood, a small chain on her glasses catching the light. "Let me see if we still have that series." She led me through a short corridor that smelled faintly of toner and canned air. A heavy door accepted her card and clicked, and we were in a vault room that had once wanted to be grand. The walls were a hive of small brass doors, each with a number and a history that could crowd a life. The hum of climate control and old electricity was constant, almost soothing. She scanned the numbers. 308, 309. She ran her finger along. Here we are. 317? She looked at me. "Your key?" I handed it over. She slid it into one side, then took a larger bank key from her pocket and turned it in the other. The two keys engaged with a soft mechanical agreement. There's something comforting about a lock answering to its proper questions. The box slid out like a drawer and landed on the small table in the center of the room. She stepped back politely. "I'll give you privacy," she said. "Take your time. Thank you, I said to her retreating kindness. For a moment I just stood there, my hands on either side of the metal. The rumor of lilacs breathed through the cold air. I heard a door close somewhere out front. Someone laughing, the rustle of papers, the life of a town that had no idea an old man was about to be rewired. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a velvet pouch, dark blue and flattened from years against the metal, and a single, ivory-colored envelope with my Margaret's handwriting on the front, 4E. If I do not return, the initial was the same as the wax had carried, the same quiet insistence. E. I didn't know whether to hate that letter or fear it. I picked up the pouch first. It was heavier than it looked. The drawstring crumbled a little in my hand, and I loosened it carefully. An object slid into my palm, a small music box no larger than a bar of soap, inlaid with mother of pearl that caught the vault light like a promise. The crank was delicate, tarnished. I turned it once gently, and the mechanism answered with a sound like a bird waking. A melody trailed into the room, hesitant and lovely. Not a tune I recognized at first, then suddenly I did. Clair de Lune, Margaret's favorite piece to hum when she was grading papers, when she was folding sheets, when she stood at the window and watched snow. The second item was the envelope. I touched it with both hands as if to steady it and me. My fingers traced the curve of her letters. If I do not return, return from where? From what? I should have opened it right then, there in the metallic quiet. Let the fluorescent hum mark the moment, but something in me pulled back the way a horse braces at a ditch. I set the envelope on the table and turned the music box crank again, a little more. The melody filled the room and then faltered, as if grease had given way to grit. The last notes hung like breath. I could almost see her in our Boston kitchen, 1984, hair falling loose, eyes tired, but kind, humming that same soft line while Lily slept, and the city outside rattled with taxis and impatience. Don't read it yet, her voice said again. Not harsh, not pleading, just the steady, quiet Margaret tone that had gotten me through layoffs and broken pipes and grief. I stood there with my hand on the envelope and understood that the first letter had not been the end of the beginning. It had been the beginning of the true thing. Whatever E was, whoever they were, the answer was a layer deeper than a key in a vault. It was in this envelope. It was in what she had chosen to place in the dark with a melody she had loved. I slid everything back into the box and closed the lid. For the first time since the knock at dusk, I felt the old plain strength of my spine return to me. Quiet resilience, Margaret used to call it, when she'd squeeze my hand in the doctor's office and say, "We're fine, Tom. We are us." I carried the box to the door and pressed the bell for the attendant. The woman reappeared with her warm professional silence. She nested the drawer back into its place and checked the numbers like a priest with a ritual. "All set?" she asked. "For today," I said. I thanked her. I walked out through the lobby into the wide brightness of late morning. On the green, a boy kicked a ball so hard it skittered across wet grass, and his dog chased the splash it made. The church bell struck the quarter hour. The day smelled like things you can forgive. I sat in the truck with the music box and Margaret's second envelope on the seat beside me. I did not open it. Not yet. It sounds like foolishness when I tell it, like a coward's errand around pain. But I felt her there in the silence, felt that same thoughtful patience that had held me through worse than mysteries, and I knew I would read it when the light softened, when the house could witness it, when her photograph could look on. Maybe that was superstition. Maybe it was love. Often they share a doorstep. I drove back the long way, through the roads that cut the ridge and wander home. The clouds gathered again as if to think it over. The shadows under the oaks deepened like ink. At Willow Creek, I parked, cut the engine, and sat with my hands quiet on the wheel. The cottage waited with the familiarity of a well-learned song. Inside, I set the music box on the piano and laid the envelope beside it. I opened the window to let the day in. The creek's voice braided with the wind and a faint, unmistakable sweetness drifted across the room. Lilacs, of course. I rested my fingertips on the piano keys. Not enough to press them, just enough to feel the cool ivory. Through the reflection in the lacquered wood, I watched the envelope sit untroubled and still, cream against the dark. "Tonight," I said to the room. "We read it tonight." Outside, a bird began a call and answer with its patient mate. The house exhaled a long, settled breath. I understood then that I was not walking into a betrayal alone. I was walking toward the truth with the woman I had loved in all her ordinary, steadfast days, and in at least one extraordinary hidden one. The difference between a wound and a seam is whether you let it heal into something that can hold. I turned the crank of the music box once. The first notes of Claire de Lune rose and hovered, then fell. The sound was small and perfect, the kind of small that makes rooms larger. I sat down in my chair by the window to wait for evening, and for the story inside the last envelope to find me. The door to the rectory closed behind me with a soft thud, the kind that sounds final. Warm light spilled across a narrow hallway lined with old photographs, parish picnics, communion classes, a few faded portraits of priests and nuns long gone. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and something older beneath it, a scent of paper and wax and years. The woman who'd answered the door led me down the hall without another word. Her step was slow but sure, the rhythm of someone used to silence. When we reached a small sitting room, she gestured for me to take a seat. The walls were lined with shelves of worn books, a cross above the mantel, a low fire whispering in the grate. She poured tea from a chipped white pot, the kind that had seen 1,000 small confidences. "You said your name was Carver?" she asked finally, her voice measured, steady. "Yes, Thomas Carver." "And Margaret was your wife?" "She was." Her eyes softened at that. God rest her soul. She was a good woman. I felt the weight of those words and the quiet truth behind them. "You knew her, then?" "I did." She folded her hands in her lap. "Though not as well as you, I imagine. Or perhaps in a way you did not." The way she said it made something cold flicker in my chest. I reached into my coat pocket and laid the ivory envelope on the table. "She mentioned you," I said, "in a letter I found. Said you could be trusted if there was trouble." The woman stared at the envelope as if she recognized its shape. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment she said nothing. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I remember that letter. And I remember Margaret." Her eyes lifted to mine. "I suppose you've learned about Eleanor." I nodded, barely able to speak. "I have." She let out a breath that trembled at the end. "Then I can tell you the rest." The fire snapped. Outside, rain pressed softly against the windows. She began slowly, her voice thin at first but steadying as the story took its shape. "Margaret came to see me in the spring of 1984. She was desperate but composed, the kind of woman who keeps her dignity even when her heart is breaking. She said she had reason to believe her daughter, the one she gave up years before, was living somewhere near Ashfield. A woman named Eleanor. She'd received a letter from someone claiming to know where the girl was. It wasn't signed, only marked with that same initial. E. E again, I murmured. "Yes." She nodded. "Margaret told me she didn't trust the letter, but she couldn't ignore it either. She asked for my help quietly. I had connections then, records from the orphanage where Eleanor had been placed. We found fragments, birth dates, foster reports, but nothing that could lead us to her. The adoption had been sealed by the courts. Margaret wanted to open it, but she was afraid. Afraid of what she might find. Afraid of who might get hurt." Her eyes dropped to her folded hands. "When she realized the trail had gone cold, she left that music box with me. Said if anything ever happened to her, I should make sure it stayed safe. She never told me she'd placed it in the vault. I assumed she'd taken it home." I felt a tightness in my chest. "And you never heard from her again?" "Not after that spring." We sat in silence for a moment. The rain softened to a whisper against the glass. Finally, she reached across the table, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the edge of the envelope. "She loved you deeply, Mr. Carver." I could see it in her eyes even when she was drowning in guilt. "That's why she kept it from you. Not to deceive you, but to spare you the burden of something she didn't know how to mend." Her words were kind, but they didn't ease the ache. They deepened it. "I don't want to be spared anymore," I said quietly. "I just want the truth. I want to know if Eleanor's still alive." Sister Hester studied me for a long moment. The firelight flickered across her face, casting lines like folded paper. You understand, she said finally, some truths come at a cost. I've already paid most of what life can take from me, I said. What's left is only time. That seemed to reach her. She rose slowly and walked to a cabinet near the far wall. From a stack of old binders, she pulled a leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked with age. She placed it on the table and opened it to a page marked with a thin ribbon. These are my notes from that year. I kept them against the rules, something I've asked forgiveness for more times than I can count. Her finger traced a column of names. Here, Margaret Carver. And here, Eleanor. The handwriting was neat, almost clerical. My eyes followed the line she pointed to. Eleanor Grace Lowell, born May 19, 1962. Adopted June 1965. Final record closed 1968. The name Lowell caught my eye. Same as yours. She smiled faintly. Not by blood. It's the name I took when I entered the order. But yes, perhaps it's fitting. Do you know who adopted her? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. The record listed a couple from Vermont. Their last name was Rains. They moved shortly after the adoption was finalized. After that, the trail went cold. I never found any other record. I leaned back, the name echoing in my mind. Rains. It meant nothing to me, but it had once meant everything to Margaret. Do you think she ever found them? I don't know. But I know she never stopped hoping. Sister Hester closed the ledger gently, as though it were something sacred. When I heard she'd passed, I thought perhaps the story had ended with her. But if you found that letter, maybe it hasn't. The room fell silent except for the low hum of the fire. After a long pause, she said, I have something for you. She rose again and crossed to a tall cabinet. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a small wooden box wrapped in linen. She set it in front of me. Margaret left this with me that same spring, she said. Said it was for Eleanor if she ever came looking. I never knew what it contained. I think it's time you did. My fingers brushed the lid. It was lighter than I expected. When I lifted it, the hinges creaked softly. Inside lay a single photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. Margaret, younger by decades, her hair dark, her smile shy. In her arms, a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Beneath it, a folded note in Margaret's handwriting, her middle name is Grace. She will need that more than I will. I swallowed hard. The image blurred as my eyes filled. She came here once, Sister Hester said quietly. Eleanor. It must have been 15 years ago. She was looking for her birth records. I told her what little I could, but without Margaret's consent, I couldn't say more. She didn't leave an address. Only her name and the town she lived in then, Brattleboro. My breath caught. So she might still be there? Perhaps. Or near enough to find. The possibilities tangled inside me like roots. A daughter Margaret had lost. A woman living somewhere out there. Unaware of the man now sitting here holding the ghost of her mother's photograph. What if she doesn't want to be found? I asked quietly. Sister Hester smiled sadly. Then you will still have tried. And sometimes that's what love looks like, reaching. Even when there's no hand waiting on the other side. I looked down at the photograph again. Margaret's face glowed with a tenderness I hadn't seen in years. One reserved for beginnings, not endings. Can I keep this? I asked. She'd want you to. I slid the photograph carefully into my coat pocket beside the music box key. When I rose to leave, the rain had stopped. The world outside was washed clean, the cobblestones shining under the lamplight. Sister Hester followed me to the door. Mr. Carver, she said softly, when you find her, if you find her, tell her she was wanted. By both of you. I nodded. My throat was too tight for words. As I stepped into the cool night, I turned back once. She was still standing there in the doorway, her hand raised in a small, quiet blessing. Driving back down the hill, I felt the first edges of purpose forming again after months of drifting. The pain was still there, but it had shape now, a direction. I turned onto the main road, the tires hissing through puddles, and looked once more at the photograph on the passenger seat. Margaret's smile caught in the glow of the dashboard light. All right, my love, I whispered. We'll find her. Ahead, the sign for Route 9 pointed north toward Brattleboro, and somewhere beyond that toward Eleanor Grace. The morning I left for Vermont was pale and windless. A mist hung low over the fields, blurring the line between sky and earth, the way grief blurs the line between past and present. I stood for a long moment on the porch, listening to the quiet hum of the waking world, the distant lowing of cattle, the faint whistle of a train miles away, the rustle of oak leaves in their first turn toward autumn. Inside my coat pocket, Margaret's letter lay folded beside the photograph of her and the baby. The music box rested safely in its cloth wrapping on the passenger seat of the truck. It was all I had left of her, and now perhaps the only bridge to someone I'd never met. I locked the cottage door behind me and turned the key twice, as if sealing a chapter. The sound was final and strangely comforting. Then I drove north. The highway stretched like a quiet confession, mile after mile of two-lane road, cutting through small towns that looked untouched by time. Farmhouses leaned against the hillsides, their porches sagging with age. Barn roofs rusted into colors the sky never learned to name. I kept the radio low, just a murmur of static and music to keep the silence from growing too deep. Every few miles, a thought of Margaret would surface her hand, resting lightly on mine at stoplights, her way of singing under her breath when we drove at night. It struck me how alive she still was inside these small echoes. Death doesn't take love with it. It only changes the language we use to speak it. I stopped for coffee at a roadside diner just outside Chesterfield. The place smelled of bacon and memory. A waitress in her 60s with bright red lipstick poured me a cup and nodded toward the music box on the seat beside me. "Pretty little thing," she said. "Gift for someone special?" "Something like that," I said. She smiled in that polite way people do when they sense there's more to the story but know better than to ask. When I left, she called after me, "Safe travels, hon. Roads can be tricky this time of year." I nodded. They always are. By early afternoon, the clouds thickened, bruised with the promise of rain. The road wound through the green mountains, the trees standing in their first flush of color, gold and copper, rust and fire. The rhythm of the wipers matched the slow beat of my pulse. At a rest stop overlooking the river, I pulled over and turned off the engine. The world went still except for the steady murmur of water below. I took the photograph from my pocket. Margaret looked impossibly young in it, her smile soft but uncertain. The baby's tiny face was turned toward her chest, the way all children lean toward safety. "Grace," I whispered, "she gave you that name for a reason." The mist thickened, curling like breath on glass. I thought about the letter Sister Hester had shown me, the Rains family in Vermont, the faint thread that led to Brattleboro. There was no address, no phone number, just a name and a town. Finding Eleanor after all these years would be like chasing a ghost. But then, Margaret had lived half her life believing in ghosts, the kind that looked like hope. I reached Brattleboro by dusk. The town sat tucked along the Connecticut River, its streets narrow and steep, the buildings red-bricked and close together. The rain had started again, soft and insistent, the kind that fills the gutters and makes the world smell clean. I found a small inn near the square, the kind of place that offered more silence than service. The clerk was a young man with sleepy eyes and a stack of old postcards behind him. "Passing through?" he asked. "For now," I said. He handed me a brass key with the number 3 etched into it. "Rooms up the stairs, end of the hall. Breakfast at 7 if you're up early." I thanked him and carried my bag to the room. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old linens. I set the music box on the small writing desk by the window and opened the curtains. The street below glowed with lamplight, puddles reflecting the world twice over. For a long time I stood there watching the rain fall, thinking about Margaret, about the girl she'd been before I knew her, the mistakes she'd made, the secrets she'd carried like stones in her pockets. We all have the versions of ourselves we hope time will forget, but time forgets nothing. The next morning I walked to the town library. The rain had passed, leaving behind a thin brightness that made everything look briefly new. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and half-moon glasses, greeted me with the polite curiosity small towns reserve for strangers. "I'm trying to find someone," I told her. "A woman named Eleanor Rains. She might have lived here about 15 years ago." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Rains, that's not a name I hear often. Let's take a look." Her fingers danced across the keyboard of a dusty computer, the screen flickering as she searched. After a few moments, she nodded slowly. There was an Eleanor Raines listed in our records. She had a library card registered in 2009 address on Brookline Road. My heart gave a small, unsteady kick. Is it still active? Afraid not, she said gently. Card was canceled in 2014, but I can give you the last address we had on file. She scribbled it on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter. Thank you, I said. Good luck, she replied, and the kindness in her eyes told me she meant it. Brookline Road ran west out of town, curving through woods dappled with sun. I followed it until the pavement turned to gravel. The address led me to a small farmhouse tucked back behind a stand of birch trees. The shutters were faded blue, the porch sagging slightly at the middle. A dog barked once as I pulled into the drive, then fell silent. I climbed the steps and knocked. The door opened just a few inches, enough for a woman's voice to slip through. Can I help you? I took off my hat. I hope so. My name's Thomas Carver. I'm looking for someone named Eleanor. There was a pause, the quiet kind that measures trust. When the door opened fully, the woman standing before me looked to be in her early 60s, gray, streaking through her dark hair, eyes the color of old glass. She studied me for a long moment before speaking. I'm Eleanor, she said. Do I know you? For a second, I couldn't find my voice. The air seemed to thin around us. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it out to her. You don't know me, I said quietly, but I think you knew the woman in this picture. She took it gently, her fingers trembling as she turned it toward the light. Her breath caught. Where did you get this? She was my wife, I said. Margaret Carver. Her eyes filled, the recognition flickering through them like sunlight on water. She stopped, steadying herself. I used to have a letter from a woman by that name. Years ago. I thought it was a mistake. It wasn't, I said softly. She wrote to you. She tried to find you. Eleanor looked at the photo again, her thumb brushing the image of the baby. So she's really gone? I nodded. She closed her eyes for a long moment, her shoulders trembling with something between sorrow and release. When she looked back up, her expression had changed, still tender, but guarded the way people look when a wound reopens. And they're not sure whether to cover it or let it breathe. Come inside, she said. The living room was warm and simple shelves lined with books, a handmade quilt over the back of the couch, a fire burning low. Eleanor poured us both tea, her hands steady now. I used to dream about her, she said quietly. Never her face, not really. Just her voice. I always thought it was my imagination. She never stopped looking, I told her. She left you something. I unwrapped the music box and set it on the table between us. Her eyes widened as the light caught the mother-of-pearl inlay. She gave this to you? She left it in a vault. For you, if she never came back. I turned the crank once. Claire de Lune filled the room, slow and trembling. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand, a sound escaping her that was half a sob, half a laugh. That song, I used to hum it when I was a child. I didn't know why. I'd never heard it anywhere, but it felt familiar. She reached out and touched the box gently, as though it might vanish. She called you Grace, I said softly. Said you'd need that more than she would. Eleanor nodded, tears spilling freely now. She was right about that. We sat there in silence as the melody wound down, the final note hanging between us like breath. After a long moment, she said, Thank you for finding me. It was Margaret who found you, I said. I just followed the trail she left. She smiled faintly through her tears. Then maybe she's still guiding you. I looked toward the window, where the rain had begun again, tracing silver lines down the glass. She always was. When I left an hour later, Eleanor stood on the porch, the music box cradled in her hands. If you ever want to visit again, she said, you'll always have a place here. I think I might, I said. There's more to tell you, more she'd want you to know. I'd like that. As I turned to go, she called after me. Mr. Carver, did she ever forgive herself? I paused at the gate, the question heavy between us. Not completely, I said. But she learned how to live beside the ache. Sometimes that's what forgiveness looks like. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. Then maybe I can too. The drive back into town was quiet. The sun had broken through the clouds, spilling gold across the wet road. I lowered the window slightly, letting the cool air move through the truck. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me loosen. Not the grief, not the love, but the weight between them. Somewhere behind me, a melody lingered. And for the first time, it didn't sound like goodbye. For 2 nights after meeting Eleanor, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret Young again, holding that baby close, the same faint smile caught in the old photograph. And I saw Eleanor too, the way she'd stood on her porch in the rain. The music box pressed to her chest like something fragile she'd just remembered how to hold. There was peace in what I'd done, but also a question that kept rising in the dark like a whisper I couldn't unhear. Who sent that first letter in 1984, the one that lured Margaret to Ashfield? It hadn't been signed, only marked with the initial E, but Margaret had written back to that same letter, believing it came from her lost daughter. And Sister Hester had said no such letter existed in the official records. Someone, somewhere, had known enough of the truth to draw Margaret into that web, and they'd hidden themselves well. On the third morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing against the nightstand. The sky outside was still pale and half-formed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code was Vermont. I answered. Thomas Carver. There was a pause, then a voice soft, hesitant, unmistakably Eleanor's. Mr. Carver, I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, I said, sitting up. Everything all right? I think so. But there's something you should see. Something I found this morning. What is it? I'm not sure yet, but it's about her, about Margaret. Her tone carried that fragile mix of fear and hope I'd heard once before, when she'd held the music box for the first time. I can be there in an hour, I said. The drive back to the farmhouse felt shorter this time, as if the road itself remembered me. The mist had burned off by mid-morning, leaving the hills sharp and clear against a soft blue sky. When I pulled into the drive, Eleanor was already on the porch, a folder tucked under her arm. Coffee, she asked. Please. We sat at the small table by the window, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. She set the folder between us and opened it. Inside were several old envelopes, their corners yellowed, the ink faint but legible. I was cleaning the attic, she said, and found a box I hadn't touched in years. It must have belonged to my adoptive mother. She kept everything, letters, cards, even receipts from church donations. And then, buried under a stack of bills, I found these. I leaned closer. The handwriting on the top envelope stopped my breath. Margaret's, but not her usual neat, deliberate hand. This script was hurried, almost frantic. What do they say? I asked. Eleanor unfolded the first letter carefully. This one's dated May 3rd, 1984, 3 weeks after the last one you found. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. Dearest Eleanor, I have not written since Ashfield because I fear what I set in motion there. I trusted the wrong person. The man who claimed to know you, he wasn't who he said he was. He knew things he shouldn't have, details only someone from the orphanage could know. I believe he worked there once. His name was Edward Haynes. Eleanor stopped, her eyes darting up to me. Haynes, she repeated. Not Raines? Just one letter off. My stomach sank. You think it's the same man? Maybe. Or someone pretending to be connected to the family who adopted me. She kept reading. He told me he could reunite us if I helped him retrieve certain papers from the parish records files that were sealed after the adoptions closed. I was foolish enough to agree. I thought it was the only way to find you. But when I realized what he wanted, I refused. I left him at the train station and never looked back. If anything happens to me, Sister Hester will know where to find what he wanted. Tell her not to trust anyone who uses the name Haynes. The letter ended there. The signature rushed but clear Margaret. Eleanor folded the paper slowly, her hands trembling. So it wasn't just guilt she carried. It was fear. I nodded, the pieces falling into place like an unwelcome truth. Someone was using her secret against her. She looked at me. But why? What could he possibly gain from it? Records, I said. The adoption files. He might have been selling information, names, histories. That kind of thing was more common than people realized. Eleanor shook her head. She must have been terrified. She was, I said quietly. But she still went to the bank, still left the music box for you. That was her way of fighting back. We sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of it settle. Outside, wind moved through the trees, scattering leaves across the porch. After a long pause, Eleanor said, "There's one more thing." She reached into the folder and pulled out a smaller envelope, unmarked except for a phone number written in pencil. This was tucked inside the same box. The paper's newer, maybe 10 years old. I turned it over, studying the faded digits. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. "Have you called it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I didn't want to do it alone." We sat there for a moment, staring at that number as if it might speak on its own. Then I took out my phone and dialed. The line rang once, twice, three times. Then a voice answered, male, older, careful. "Hello? Good morning," I said. "I'm looking for someone named Edward Haynes." The silence on the other end was long and taut. "Then who is this?" "My name's Thomas Carver. I'm calling about Margaret Carver." A breath caught. When he spoke again, the voice was thin, weary. "You shouldn't have this number." "Maybe not," I said. "But you wrote it down for someone who did." He exhaled sharply, the sound of a man cornered by ghosts. "I didn't mean for any of it to go that far." "Then help me understand," I said. "You reached out to her in 1984. Why?" A pause, then the faint clink of a lighter. "I was working at the St. Agnes orphanage back then. Clerical staff. I had access to records no one else could touch. When Margaret's request came through to reopen her file, I saw an opportunity. I thought if she paid for the information, I could finally get out of that place. But she saw through me. She was smarter than I expected." "You lied to her," I said. "Yes," he admitted, "but not about everything. She really did come close to finding her daughter. The Rains family was real. I just didn't know where they'd moved. By the time I tried to make it right, she'd already disappeared." His voice cracked on that last word. Eleanor leaned closer, mouthing silently, "Ask him where she went." "Do you know what happened after she left Ashfield?" I asked. A long exhale. "Then she was followed. I warned her to be careful. There were others who wanted those files, people who paid for secrets. I heard later she'd turned the material over to a nun in Ashfield. After that, she vanished. I thought she'd gone into hiding. I didn't know she died." He went quiet again, the silence full of old shame. "Mr. Haynes," I said finally, "there's a woman here who deserves to know the truth. Her name is Eleanor Grace." A breath on the other end. "Then softly she found you." "Yes," I said. "And she deserves to know everything you took from her." There was no answer, only the sound of him breathing. Then in a voice that had lost all pretense, he said, "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I kept one thing safe." "What thing?" "The last file. Her mother's confession. It's in my desk drawer in Brattleboro. The old boarding house on Main Street. Room 4. If you want it, come before Sunday. After that, it'll be gone." And then the line went dead. Eleanor stared at me, eyes wide. "A confession?" "That's what he said." "Do you believe him?" I looked down at my hands, the faint tremor I couldn't quite hide. "I believe a man who's haunted enough to hide wants to be found before the ghosts do." She nodded slowly. "Then we go together." We reached Brattleboro by early afternoon. The boarding house sat above an antique store. The sign faded to near illegibility. The hallway smelled of dust and varnish. Room 4 was at the end, the door half open. Inside, the curtains were drawn, the air stale. Papers covered the desk, receipts, letters, clippings. But the drawer he'd mentioned was unlocked. Inside was a thin folder labeled Carver, Margaret Statement 1984. Eleanor lifted it carefully, her breath unsteady. "Do we open it here?" "No," I said. "Not in this room." We carried it outside, down to the small park overlooking the river. The water moved dark and fast beneath the bridge. I sat on the bench beside her as she unfolded the single sheet inside. Margaret's handwriting again, tired, deliberate. "If this reaches you, it means the truth has finally caught its breath. I made mistakes. I lied when I thought it would keep others safe. But what I want remembered is simple. I loved my child. I loved my husband. And if I carried silence too long, it was only because I didn't know how to speak both loves aloud at once. Eleanor Grace, you are the part of me that never stopped hoping. Thomas, you are the reason I believed in redemption at all. When you find each other, Forgive the years I lost between you. The page ended with her familiar signature. No flourish, no date, just her name. We sat there for a long while, the sound of the river filling the quiet. Eleanor folded the page gently, her eyes wet but steady. She found the words after all, she whispered. Yes, I said. And she gave them to us. She looked at me, then really looked, and for the first time, I saw Margaret in her face. The same calm, the same quiet strength. She'd be proud of you, Eleanor said softly. I smiled, the ache turning to something almost like peace. She'd be proud of both of us. As the afternoon light softened, the wind carried the faintest scent of lilacs out of season, impossible and yet unmistakably hers. And in that moment, I understood. The last letter had never really been about secrets. It had been about release, about finding the courage to pass love forward instead of holding it back. We sat there until the light faded and the river darkened, two souls bound by the same handwriting, finally learning how to let the past rest. We buried Margaret's letters under the oak behind my cottage, not to hide them, but to give them a place to rest. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and the air carried the scent of pine and wet earth. Eleanor knelt beside me, her hands gentle as she pressed the final envelope into the soil. She always liked this tree, I said quietly. Said it felt like an old friend keeping watch. Eleanor smiled faintly. Then she'll have company. We stood in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need words to hold meaning. The creek murmured nearby, its steady rhythm like a memory being retold. The wind brushed through the branches, scattering gold leaves that landed softly at our feet. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like listening. It had been 3 days since we found Margaret's confession in the folder from the boarding house. 3 days of reading and rereading her words, of letting them settle like rain into the soil of our understanding. She had written of love and guilt, of mistakes made in the name of protection, and of a truth too fragile to live in daylight. But she had also written of hope of a day when the two people she loved most would finally find each other. And somehow that day had come. Eleanor had stayed in Brattleboro one night longer to pack her things, to close what pieces of her old life could still be closed. Then she drove down to Willow Creek in an old station wagon that rattled like memory but still ran strong. When she stepped onto my porch that afternoon, it felt less like the arrival of a stranger, and more like the return of a missing note in a song I'd been humming half my life. We spent the next day sorting through Margaret's keepsakes, her letters, her teaching journals, the sheet music she'd written in pencil so many years ago. Eleanor read each page with reverence, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. She wrote like she lived, Eleanor said once, holding up a page of music. Every note exactly where it should be, even when it hurt. She believed beauty could make sense of pain, I told her. Said it was the only way to forgive the world for breaking things we love. Eleanor nodded, her eyes tracing the staff lines. Maybe that's why she wrote to me. Not to explain, but to forgive. That night, we ate a simple meal by the fire stew, bread and tea. The house felt fuller than it had in years. Margaret's photograph still hung above the mantel, but it seemed different now, less like a memory, more like a presence, finally at peace. When the fire burned low, Eleanor turned to me. What do we do now? I thought about that for a long moment. We finish her story, I said, and then we start ours. The next morning, I took the typewriter from the attic, a heavy old Royal that Margaret used to grade essays. I set it on the table by the window where the light was best. Eleanor brought coffee and the stack of letters. We began to write not new words, but the ones Margaret had already written, typed out clean and clear. Each click of the keys felt like breathing life into her again. Sometimes Eleanor would stop, her fingers resting on the paper. She wrote this when she was my age, she'd whisper, almost to herself. I wonder if she was lonely. She was, I said softly, but she loved through it. That's how she survived. By evening, we had everything typed and arranged, the letters, the confession, the photograph. Together, they told a story not just of secrets, but of endurance. I placed the pages in a manila envelope and wrote on the front, the last letter, Margaret L. Carver, 1984. Eleanor looked at the title and smiled. You think she'd like that? She'd love it, I said. She always believed in endings that circle back to beginnings. That night, I dreamed of her. We were standing in the old Boston apartment, sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. She was humming Claire de Lune while washing dishes, her sleeves rolled up, her hair catching the light. When she turned to me, her eyes were calm. You did well, she said. Did I? Yes. You listened. Then she smiled the same soft, knowing smile she wore the first time I told her I loved her, and the dream dissolved into light. I woke before dawn, the house quiet except for the whisper of the creek through the open window. The scent of lilacs filled the air, faint but unmistakable. Eleanor was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. She looked up and smiled. Couldn't sleep either? Not much, I said, taking the chair across from her. We sat there in the gentle half-light, sipping our coffee, saying little. The world outside was waking slow, the birds first, then the soft shift of the wind. Finally, Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the music box. I want you to have it, she said. I shook my head. It was hers, and yours. She left it for both of us, she said, setting it on the table. Her love didn't stop with one person. It grew. It always grew. She turned the crank once and the familiar melody began fragile, perfect, eternal. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first time, Claire de Lune didn't sound like memory. It sounded like continuation, like two lives finding their shared note and holding it steady. Later that day, we drove together to the small post office in town. The clerk behind the counter was an older man who smiled when he saw the envelope. Where's it headed, he asked. I glanced at Eleanor. She nodded. Home, I said. To the parish at Ashfield. He stamped the front and slid it into the outgoing bin. The sound was small but full, a promise sealed in paper. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, lifting the scent of wet earth and lilacs. She's free now, Eleanor said softly. Yes, I replied. And so are we. That evening, we sat by the fire again. The light danced across the walls, the warmth filling the room with something beyond comfort, something like peace. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze on the flames. Do you ever think she knew this would happen? That we'd find each other? I smiled. Margaret believed love always finds its way home, even if it takes a lifetime. Eleanor nodded slowly. She was right. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. Thank you, she said, for finding me, for finding her. I didn't find either of you, I said. She did. She led me here. We sat like that for a while, hand in hand, listening to the soft crackle of the fire in the creek outside. The world felt right again, not perfect, not painless, but right. Later, after Eleanor had gone to bed, I walked outside. The moon hung low over the water, silvering the grass in the porch. The oak tree stood still and strong, guarding the buried letters beneath it. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. Somewhere, faint but clear, I heard a melody carried on the wind. Claire de Lune. The notes lingered like a voice calling from another time. I smiled. Good night, Margaret, I whispered. Your story's home now. The wind shifted, and for just a heartbeat, I thought I heard her answer, soft, certain, full of love. Thank you. In that moment, I understood. Love isn't what remains after we're gone. It's what keeps moving through the people we've touched. Margaret's letters had begun as apologies, but they ended as bridges. Between past and present, between mother and daughter, between the silence of loss and the music of remembrance. And as I stood beneath the oak, listening to the creek and the wind and the faint song that seemed to come from everywhere at once, I realized the truth she had always known. The last letter is never really the last. It's simply the first one that finds its way home. In the end, every story we leave behind is a letter to someone we love. Margaret's secret wasn't about shame. It was about forgiveness, family, and the hope that love can find its way home. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe to Senior Stories for more emotional mysteries, cinematic love stories, and tales of redemption that remind us what truly lasts. Because the greatest stories aren't about how we lose love, they're about how we find it again. Thank you for listening to The Last Letter. Until next time, keep your heart open and your story unfolding.